We're continuing this week studying this book, Tomer Devorah, written by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who lived between the years of 1522 and 1570 and worked to systematize Kabbalah in the city of Tzfat in northern Israel. And this small book changes the course of Jewish thought and especially Jewish mysticism. Last week, just to recap very quickly, Rabbi Cordovero sets out his argument that we're not like God in our appearance, meaning to say there is no human being that looks more godly than the next human being. And then, so if that's true, in what way are we like God? It can only be that we possess the potential to behave, to act like God. And in that sense, we must distill down what is godly behavior. What are the divine attributes? And Rabbi Cordovero begins by explaining it through, in chapter 1, by explaining it through a quote from the book of Micah. Chapter 2, which is the subject of this week's teaching, chapter 2 is the next step, of course. And we read together, I'm on page 31. For those of you who have the handout or those of you who have my version, I'm on page 31. If you have a different version, just look for the beginning of chapter 2. Od liyot adam domeh lekono, besod midat haketer. Additionally, for a person to emulate his creator, according to the essence of the attribute of keter, the highest attribute, meaning in Hebrew the crown, or the top sphira in Kabbalah, he or she must possess several main functions, which are the main conduct of this attribute. So just like last week, we will not go through each of the functions, each of the attributes he discusses. The first being humility, the second being chokhmah, or wisdom, the third being metzach, or willingness to deal with others, the fourth being the ability to listen, the fifth being, as I scan through and try to find all of these, the ability to look away from evil, the sixth being breath and whatnot, the seventh being how to carry one's face, the eighth being how to use one's mouth for good, and so on and so on. This is the whole chapter, and we will focus this week on the first two, mostly. We'll focus on humility more than anything, as this is really the foundation for this entire chapter. Harishona, hakolelet hakol hi midat ha'anava. The first, and I'm in the second paragraph now, the first and the most encompassing is the trait of humility. It is contingent on the attribute of keter, for it is the most sublime of all the attributes. The most sublime of all the attributes. Really? That's what I thought when I read it for the first time. Humility is the most sublime of all of God's attributes. God is the most humble. So the Torah gives us one attribute of Moshe Rabbeinu. Gives us one attribute. What is the attribute that Moshe Rabbeinu is described as in the Torah? Anava, humble. He's not big and tall, according to the Torah, even though he kills a man with one punch. He is not have a short temper, although he gets upset a lot and grows up with a stutter, an ability to speak. I could go on and talk about all of the attributes that we can deduce from the things that Moses does, but the attribute that the Torah brings forward to qualify Moses for the position of being the leader for the Jewish people and knowing God face to face, unlike any other prophet ever in the world, according to the very end of the Torah, is anava, humility. And I struggled with this all week. Why would humility be the most important attribute? And then this morning, I woke up because I couldn't sleep, and I began reading Max Nordau's book, The Lies of Conventional Society. I probably butchered the title, and Dr. Melnick will correct me in Kiddush. And in it goes chapter by chapter about the lies that we're told in society and how we must rebel against those lies. And chapter 2, Max Nordau, so this is a Zionist thinker. These are the early Zionists that I'm reading. Max Nordau is not without controversy. He is also, he participates in racial science of Germany and Austria in the late 19th century as well. But he's one of the early Zionist thinkers, contributes to the World Zionist Congresses. And in this book, chapter 2 is the lie of religion. The lies of conventional society. Chapter 2 is the lie of religion. So there I am on Shabbos morning, waking up, and I read an essay by Max Nordau, who is one of the people that I'd like to, I would like to see in the museum of the World Zionist Congress. And I'm reading his chapter 2, the lie of religion. And what is the lie of religion according to Max Nordau? It is that society presents us with religion in order to keep us in our place. In order to keep us in our place. And all he has to do is point at medieval Europe around to explain how states have used religion and how only through the Enlightenment and the abolishment of religious practice, especially for Jews, he argues, can Jews reach our fullest potential because there will be nothing like a church to hold us down. And I thought about that in the context of history, because what Max Nordau lacked, like all human thinkers, is the ability to see the future. And I thought about what Europe looked like once religion was taken away. What kind of potential did man reach once religion and God above was taken away? How did we behave towards one another? I thought about the lie of religion. If religion was taken away, how it would be beneficial for Jews, really, because my grandparents, who were the beneficiaries, I guess, according to Max Nordau, of the lack of religion, ended up in concentration camps. And so I think back to religious societies, to American society. I think back to our ability to reach our fullest potential, invoking the name of God in almost every public ceremony that I've ever attended. I think about in Roadmap Genesis, as I was searching through stock footage, the moon landing, which is just being celebrated. And I believe it was President Nixon in Roadmap Genesis, the footage that we used. President Nixon says that it's like the heavens parting and touching the face of God. This is the greatest scientific step forward, the breakthrough of a generation. And we relate it to the heavens parting and being able to touch the face of God. Therein lies the difference between bad religion and good religion. Religion that's meant to hold us down, the perception of a God that's meant to hold us down, and the perception of a religion and a God that wants us to rise up and fulfill our potential. And rabbis, teachers like Rabbi Cordovero, who say, as we soar, we should constantly keep our eyes down, knowing that there is something above us, always bigger, always more profound. And we should always care for the people whom we might leave behind. That's what humility means. Humility means that even when we accomplish our greatest accomplishments, when we accomplish our greatest successes, we're still concerned about everybody else in society because we know that the strength and the wisdom and the attributes that we possess, the ability, has all come from the same source that has created them as well. There are two reasons for this. I'm back in the text. So the text says, it does not exalt itself or hold itself in esteem. On the contrary, it always descends, gazing downwards. There are two reasons for this. One reason is that it is ashamed to gaze at its cause. right? God is too overwhelming for us to constantly stare up and try to see. As a matter of fact, the Torah warns us, right? We don't want to see God. Bad things happen when we try to look directly at God. Even Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't look directly at God. God, from whom Keter emanates, watches over it all the time in order to benefit, while gazes at those below. Similarly, man should be ashamed to gaze upward in order to hold himself aloof. Rather, humankind should always lower its gaze and minimize its self-worth as much as possible. As much as possible. In my life, some of the most accomplished people I have ever met have also been the most humble people I've ever met. And when you meet somebody who is totally full of themselves, it is the most disappointing experience you will have. I see a lot of heads shaking. Simon takes golf lessons, and Simon's golf teacher tells a story about a certain prolific young man years ago who he played golf with, who was full of himself as a young man. And out of all of the championships that this golfer has won, and all of the commercials that he is on, that is the story that the teacher tells, is this child walking onto the golf course and somebody saying to him, "It's an honor to play with you." The child was 12 years old. The child looked up and said, "I know it is for you." Out of all of the great accomplishment of this man's life, this is the story that gets told about him. Because when we meet someone who has such talent, when the person believes that the talent is all his own or her own, there is nothing more disappointing. The floor absolutely drops out. This quality is contingent mainly on the head. For a person who holds himself or herself aloof by raising his or her own head upwards is, I would argue, disappointing, whereas a humble person lowers their head in the presence of others. A humble person knows that what they possess should benefit everybody. A humble person knows how much they benefit from the gifts and the talents that were bestowed upon them. It's not needed to flaunt their understanding of it. Behold, there is none so tolerant and humble as our God, whose attribute of Keter. For God's mercy is absolute, and no flaw, transgression, or strict judgment enters God's sphere. And we know this because in the Torah we hear story upon story about God being totally disappointed in us. And several times God even suggests to Moses, why don't we just throw in the whole test, right? The whole experiment. We'll destroy the Jewish people and we'll start over, just you and me. You'll be the new father of the Jewish people. And Moses time and again argues for God to give us another chance. And indeed, God has been giving us, according to Rabbi Cordovero, chance after chance after chance after chance, because if we remember from chapter 1 last week, God is an insulted king. God is the father that gives his children all the possibility in the world, and we make wrong decision after wrong decision after wrong decision, and in spite of it all, God as mother embraces us and loves us. God wants us to turn to the right path. God wants the instruction manual to be read for us in community each and every Shabbat, according to Rabbi Cordovero, as a reminder that the instructions are available to us if we want to start ever paying attention. We turn the page, and the second attribute that we should ponder, that we should consider, I'm on page 32, is chokhmah, wisdom. One's thoughts should emulate the thought process of Keter, so we should use the same process of Keter that engages humility. Just as Chokhmah never stops thinking good thoughts, and it allows no evil to enter in it because it is absolute compassion with no severity of harshness found. So if we combine wisdom with humility, we essentially can adapt the power of positive thinking. Not only do we adapt the power of positive thinking for ourselves, we have the ability to adapt the power of positive thinking for each person that we meet. Because if we think that we come from the same source as every stranger that we meet on the street, or better yet, if we think we come from the same source that of the people that we see day in, day out, that we really can't stand, right? Forget about strangers we see in the street and we think we won't get along with. Let's talk about the people that we see each and every day in our lives that we really don't want to see. If we thought for a moment that they were our family, even better, our friends, that we had to be because we both came from the same source, that we both had the same worth, that we looked at everybody with humility in the sense that they also have the ability to reach a certain potential in their life, and that potential might not be ours, and they might be on a totally different path, but we truly want what's best for them, then wisdom would be applied to ourselves and to them, wanting the best for each and every person that we meet. Just as it is the essence of Chokhmah, of the primal Torah. Uchmo shehisod Chokhmah Torah Keduma, meaning the Torah before the Torah. The actual instruction manual, the DNA of the world itself. Where all the secrets of the Torah are contained, so too one should be explained. Each of us comes from a Adam Geduma. Each of us comes from a person before us that leads to a primordial person, a primordial ancestor, like the Torah itself. And the fact that we read the Torah and we bring it out of the Aron Kodesh, and I bring it around the sanctuary and everybody rushes to kiss it. I don't know how many people have ever thought about this. How many things could I bring into this room that everybody would rush to kiss at one time? And in some way, it's because each of our ancestors has taught us, each of our teachers have taught us. Peer pressure influences us, that when the Torah comes out of the ark, we walk over to kiss it. We encourage children to walk over to kiss it. And if we treated each human being like that, because we didn't just see the current representation of the Torah, we saw Torahs upon Torahs upon Torahs going back all the way to Mount Sinai. And in each person, we saw parents upon parents upon parents going all the way back to a mutual parent, to a mutual connection. Rabbi Cordovero believes that we might rush up to one another and kiss one another as well. I'm going to skip now to page 39, the last page of our handout. I have found a remedy. There's a medicine, okay? So in our language today, there's a pill that we can take, okay? It's good. This is good news. Whereby a person can accustom themselves to these things little by little, possibly curing himself or herself of the disease of haughtiness and allowing himself or herself to enter the gates of humility. It's much easier to become wise than it is to become humble. Wisdom can be acquired through books. Humility, Rabbi Cordovero has to brainstorm a day-by-day workout regimen for us in order to try to accustom ourselves to humility. I know everybody knows somebody in their life and they're thinking to themselves, wisdom is not attainable either. But I'm telling you, wisdom is attainable. Humility is the harder attribute to grasp. So the first thing, and I'm just going to go through the first two of these, one should accustom himself or herself to fleeing as far as possible from honor. Right? So when somebody walks up to you and says, "You are so great, I'm so glad you were a part of," the idea that we accept that, according to Rabbi Cordovero, is not the proper response. I'm so glad you were there. I'm so glad all of us could be a part of it. I'm so glad that this happened in our community. And the second step, one should accustom their mind to seeing the shameful side of themselves. In quotes, although other people don't know of my lack of worth, what of it? Other people can't see this shortcoming, but I know it's there. And in that way, this chapter begins even more than chapter 1, even more than the Hakdamah, the introduction. This chapter begins our march towards the high holidays, towards the Yamim Noraim. Because we all stand together and we say the Al Chetz over and over and over again, and for most of us, God willing, the vast majority of that list does not apply. Right? If you're standing here and you really have to say Al Chet, you really have to say, that I'm sorry for murder and theft and embezzlement and all these things, then we should make an appointment in my office. Most of us don't have to say sorry for the entire list. But the reason we say sorry for the entire list is to not force us to stand up individually and to say sorry for the line that applies to only us. Think what that would look like if each of us had to stand up in community and say, I'm sorry for lying to my spouse, or I'm sorry for lying to my children, or I'm sorry for misleading my community about this. Think about how painful that would be to stand alone and have to say that. And so we create a system where we stand together and we read a list of dozens and dozens and dozens of I'm sorries so that none of us know which one applies. But this process actually should begin, according to Rabbi Cordovero, today, or preferably even yesterday. So that when we get to the list, we've actually taken a step outside of ourselves, just like the Parsha today. And we've seen ourselves from the perspective of even our enemies. We see the perspective of Balak of the Jewish people. And when we step outside ourselves, and then we really start examining our self-worth, cheshbon hanefesh, when we start real reflection, then we're on a real path to change. We're on a real path to tshuva. We're on a real path to a greater sense of humility and love. Shabbat shalom.